much ado, I'd like to ask the professor, who's traveled all the way from Canada, to join us. And inshallah, we should have question and answer session. And we hope to finish by about 12:45, 12:50. So, Professor Badawi, Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah again. I have to apologize for a number of things. First, that the sessions were back to back. That doesn't give you much time to, get a break from me. But the reason simply that I flew last night from a meeting of the European Council of Ifta and Research just for that function. And I have to fly back this afternoon to continue the deliberations in Istanbul, Turkey. Secondly, I know that many of you might have questions from the first session as well. I'll try my best to be as brief as possible, and perhaps we can entertain the questions first on the topic, but if there is some carryover, if you wish, we can also address similar issues as well. To make it easy to follow, when we deal with the question of social justice, we can look at two levels. One is conceptual, one is applied. This is basically the two parts I'd like to cover very, very succinctly. First of all, there are 9 issues conceptually that relate to when we speak about social justice. First one is the fact that Islam as a deen, D-E-E-N, which actually literally in Arabic deen means way of living. It has a comprehensive nature. It does not deal with what belongs to God and what belongs to humans. Actually, it deals with the spiritual, social, even political, spiritual, moral aspects of life, all integrated in one whole. Likewise, when we speak about social justice, mind should not be just focused on the economic justice or distributive justice. This is only a subset of that. Just want to emphasize that from the beginning. It is a much broader thing. Secondly, social justice in Islam is a subset of the teaching of Islam, and as such it is rooted, and it's not irrelevant or too far, it is rooted in faith in the one true God as the creator, sustainer, cherisher, provider of the universe. And this is very essential when we look at the implication to the concept of property, that property ultimately in the absolute sense belongs to God alone. We don't own anything. We own nothing. God is the real owner of the universe and everything therein. However, individual property that we have today is a special type of property. It is transient property, to use it to achieve the will of God. Thirdly, the mission and purpose of creation of human being, as described in the Quran, especially in chapter 2, but elsewhere as well, to be the trustee of God on earth. This has implication that one's behavior should be in accordance with the will of the one who appointed us as trustees, the real owner. This has implication also in Muslim vision of property. If indeed property is transient, given to us by the real owner, it means that when he says that there is a share of the poor and needy in your property, then it would be betrayal of our trusteeship not to fulfill his will. It means also that I cannot say I burn my property. It is my property, so I just get my money or my home and burn it. I'm not supposed to do that because I'm not a real owner any more than what Islam, by way of analogy, prohibits committing suicide, because you have no right to destroy the body that God gave you as a trust, and He is the real owner. So it has implication even in the pure economic analysis. Number 4, it is related to the Quranic vision of human nature, which is summed up in the 32nd chapter in the Quran from verses 6 to 9 in particular, but emphasized elsewhere, that the human being has 3 interrelated, they're not separate, interrelated, interdependent elements. There is the physical body, there is the intellect, not just mind or thinking, because animals also think, intellect, complex reasoning, as well as the most important element, the spirit, which is symbolized in the Quran by God breathing something of His spirit into every human being. What is the relevance of that to the question of justice? The relevance is that when we deal with the human being in a broader concept of justice, we need to cater not only to the physical needs, like for example the communist systems or approach to economics, that we need to cater, yes, to the body because it's a reality, physical body. We need to cater to the intellect, that's the freedom of thinking, freedom of debate and dialogue. And we need to cater also to spiritual needs for what does it, just like the blessed Jesus, peace be upon him, said that man does not live by the bread alone. Yes, man cannot live without bread, but he's quite right. Man does not live by bread alone. There's intellect and there's spirit to be nourished as much as the stomach need to be nourished as well. Fifthly, the Quran gives a vision of the resources that God has created in this universe, that everything in the universe has been created to help the human being to fulfill that trust. And as such, a Muslim does not see the universe and resources and the powers that God created in nature or natural laws as enemy. The expression of subduing nature, overcoming nature, is not a totally acceptable Islamic term. The universe is created as a friend, and we need to understand also the laws working in the universe to avoid harm that is resulting from our lack of understanding or dealing with the universe. In fact, one amazing verse in the Quran says that God has made subservient to you, O humans, everything, not only on earth, but in heavens, which means even natural laws themselves are part and parcel of the serving life on earth as God wills. The sixth concept is the equality of human beings. I'm not saying Muslims, equality of human beings. Because irrespective of diversity in ethnic, cultural, national, religious basis, all humans share the same parents, as the Quran indicates in the beginning of the 4th surah. They come from the same parents, so there is an overarching brotherhood of all humans. In that sense, they're all one family. They are also equal in basic human nature. Yes, there are immense individual differences. There's no problem with that. But in terms of basic human nature, physical, and some aspect of psychology also of the human being, there are a lot to share among all human beings. Thirdly, they are all equal in terms of their ultimate destiny. Nobody says, I'm so distinct from other human beings, I'm not gonna die. I mean, everybody shared that, and if one is believer in God, not only Muslims but other faith communities, that there is also life to come in some form or the other, depending on the interpretation. All human beings have been given certain duties, and they face reward and punishment in this life and the hereafter for their action. And all human beings are supposed to be equal before the law and courts of law. The seventh concept is human dignity, which appears succinctly mentioned in chapter 17, verse 70. And it is interesting to note that it is not speaking only about dignity of Muslims. Those who know Arabic, when the Quran used the term an-nas, means all humankind. Children of Adam, Muslims are not the only children of Adam. And that's exactly what the Quran says in that chapter. That indeed, God says, we dignified or honored the children of Adam. That dignity is not a mere motherhood statement. It is manifest in the Quran, for example, in chapter 5, verse 32, which says that taking a life without justification is like killing the whole humanity, and saving one life is like saving the whole of humanity, something that resonates very well also with biblical concept. And the Quran actually says this is what God revealed to Israelite prophets as well. But it is not only saving life. The Muslim jurist also said that if indeed there is respect for human life, it means also entitlement to support, entitlement for food, clothing, shelter, security, as well as treatment in case of illness. It is manifest as well in the respect of basic freedoms, and that could be a whole session in itself, basic freedoms. It is also manifest quite clearly both in the Quran and the saying of the Prophet, that for a human being to be a better human being, it is not contingent on any of the categories that people think of. It is a beautiful verse in chapter 49, verse 13. It says, "O humankind, all, we created you from a single male and a female." It could translate male and female, or males and females. "And we made you into nations and tribes, that you may get to know and recognize one another. Lo, the most honored of you in the sight of God is one who is most righteous." So here the diversity of colors and languages is one of the signs of God. It is confirmed in chapter 30, for example, verse 22 also, that speak about the signs of God's power and mercy is the creation of heavens and earth and the diversity of your languages and your complexion. So there are two implications here. Diversity is no ground for either superiority or inferiority. Secondly, to be a better human being, the only criterion acknowledged in the Quran is righteousness, not even religious claim, not even claim of theological correctness. The eighth concept out of 9 is the solidarity and mercy, as quoted in the first session. The mission of the Prophet has been summed up in one sentence in the Quran in chapter 21, "Mercy unto the worlds." And by the way, the worlds mean the world of human and the world of animals, for he taught kindness to animals. The word of vegetation, he taught about not cutting trees even in the battlefield, and the word of ecology, and these are all documented from the early days of Islam. So mercy to the worlds at large. But for the human beings, of course, it is very important to examine this notion of human brotherhood that I mentioned earlier, which allow for plurality, allow for diversity in unity, and unity in spite of certain areas of diversity. Just to give you an example of this, in Medina, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, saw a funeral procession of a Jew. So he stood up. So one of his companions wondered about that, simply because there were certain conflict with some tribes, some Jewish tribes in Medina. There are in Ibn Hisham or Ibn Ishaq, there are details of how they really hurt the Prophet and hurt Muslims. So he said, people who did all of that to the community and did not follow the treaty they signed with the Prophet. And the Prophet, you standing opposite, he said, "It is a funeral of a Jew." And the Prophet, peace be upon him, snaps back, "Alaysat nafsan?" Is it not a soul? Is it not a soul or a spirit? Meaning that God created. So it's actually a very important concept to keep in mind, that there is a moral obligation on those trustees of God to collectively work out to make sure that the needs of humans, physical, intellectual, and spiritual, are catered for. The 9th is adl. Many people will say justice, but I beg to say that there is a difference between the concepts of adl, the Arabic term ADL, and the concept of justice. If you look into Arabic, in English dictionaries to start with, they speak about justice mostly in terms of mutuality of rights and obligations. However, the Arabic term is much deeper than that. Adl actually means balance. And as a concept, it is not only in economics. In chapter 55 in the Quran, God speaks about the mizan, the balance that God established in the creation. So on the cosmic order, there is balance between the heavenly bodies, constellations, and coordination between that cosmic order and life on earth. And there is balance on earth, as we call, for example, the ecological balance. This is part of adl, it's not just justice. Adl also, yes, has its implication in terms of rights and duties, but it applies to environment as well. Because when God speaks in the Quran about the heavens and earth and the creation, it says, don't disturb that balance. That's what we call ecological balance, and that's also one meaning of that. But we'll focus as we go on economic justice, because it's something which is not just theoretical, something that's very relevant and touches the life of many people. That leads me to the second part, and I'll be again as brief as possible. This is fine and dandy as concept, as framework or roots, but what are the exact forms in which those beautiful concepts can be translated into reality? 4 points. 1, The concept of zakah. I am hesitant, as I made in my tips, and by the way, all my tips on that, this and similar subject can be found on islamonline.net, and you go to the main page, the home page. There is a link, special link on the left-hand side. It's called Islamic Teachings, and you find about 176 hours of taping. This used to be TV programs on various topics, including economics and others. They're all classified by topic. So I refer you to details there. But basically, zakah as a concept, which is one of the pillars of Islam, is not mere charity. Because etymologically, it comes from a root term that means purity and growth. Zakah is used in the Quran also to mean purification of the soul as well. It described, for example, John the Baptist, that he was zakah himself, not that he was charity, that he was a pure person. The same thing about other prophets as well. But of course, in the practical sense, zakah also means the roughly charity. It is not exactly tithe, and it differs from charity also because sometimes charity is seen as voluntary. You do it or you don't. In Islam, it is one of the pillars of Islam, and it can be enforced actually and collected by the states. The minimum of that zakah is 2.5%, not of income. Otherwise, you'd say it would be much better than taxes here in Britain or Canada, which is even much higher. Okay, zakah actually is 2.5% of assets, not of income. So your income would go into assets. However, like modern systems, zakah also has room for exemptions, non-taxable things. And basic clothing, homes, tools of the profession are exempt from zakah. So it's actually assets beyond the basic need that the human need to survive and be productive. The deserving of zakah are 8 categories in the Quran. I just mentioned the 6 that are more relevant in today's world. This includes the poor, and a poor actually, some define it differently, but it will end up that the 2 categories supplement one another. A poor is someone who may have something but not enough for their life. In fact, for example, a person who's working at minimum pay, and Islam encourages people not to just live in a welfare state without necessity. The Quran encourages people, and the Sunnah, the Hadith of the Prophet, to work and produce. But what happens in Western countries, if I may, well, even in other countries as well, that somebody might say is, it is better for me to get social welfare than to work at minimum wage. A true Muslim would not do that. He would work at minimum wage because that's dignity and that person is offering something to society. But if that minimum wage is not enough, then he would be a deserving of zakah. So zakah is not only to the unemployed. You could be employed and you're still in need to meet the needs of your family. In that case, you could also be a deserving of zakah. That's different from the second category of maskeen, which is mean indigent, people who doesn't have anything, like homeless people, and of course these need even more care. It includes those employed, payment of salaries of those employed to collect zakah. It includes also those in debt, not because of bad decision or disobedience, but somebody who went bankrupt because of severe circumstances. They could also be helped. There is a category of the wayfarers, people like homeless or people who are traveling, even if they were rich and there is no means for them, they could be helped as well. And then there is a category, it says, fi sabilillah, in the way of God. Some traditional scholars interpreted that to mean only for supporting defense, as mentioned earlier, defense against aggression or oppression. But there are scholars also like Dr. Qaradawi in his doctoral dissertation, 2-volume on the fiqh or understanding of zakah, where he extended beyond that. He says, for example, for Muslims living in the West, zakah could be paid to establish Islamic schools to teach them, their faith and the moral values of Islam. They could be used also in other categories. The second of 4. And by the way, before I leave the compulsory one, I must say that there is also another compulsory special zakah that every Muslim should pay at the end of month of fasting, known as zakatul fitr. So this is a compulsory one as well, if a person is able to. Secondly, there is the sadaqah, which means a charity beyond zakah. And the Prophet has been very sensitive to go beyond the minimum requirement. For example, he says that if there is any neighborhood that a person wakes up hungry next morning, then God and His Messenger dissociate themselves from them. The Quran praises those who give the food to people who are in need, and by the way, it doesn't distinguish again whether a person is a believer or not. The Prophet spoke about the rights of neighbors as well in terms of their needs, regardless whether they are Muslim neighbors or not. The whole purpose of the principles of Islamic economy, I'm not talking about system, principles of Islamic economy really, is to prevent the accumulation of huge amount of wealth in a few hands. And that is mentioned specifically in the Quran in chapter 9, so that wealth would not be circulated only among the select or a few people. So the idea is not to take from people everything they have or to have everybody have equal income, but to reduce the gap between rich and poor. Finally, number 4, there are numerous other areas in Islamic teaching which has been not only documented from the Quran and Hadith, but in many cases also has been practiced culturally throughout Muslim history with some degrees of perfection or imperfection, depending on the time. This includes lending people what they need. The Prophet spoke about your neighbor borrowing some bucket from you to get water from the well, needle. You should not withhold equipment if you can lend it to someone else. There is also a system of trying to help those who want to preserve their chastity by getting married where money or income is not enough, by reducing the demands on marital gifts, which unfortunately many Muslims today are not following, to make it easy for young people to get married without demanding too much exorbitant amount of money. To encourage people also who may not be having enough to get married, they have some but not enough, to give them temporary help through the public treasury. There is also disasters. There is an obligation in case of disaster to forget just about limits of zakah and sadaqah, to make sure that basic needs are met. There is an interesting system in the Quran where people commit certain sins, and the atonement of that sins would be in some cases also to give charity to the poor or to free a person in bondage. To conclude, even with these 3, I did not do justice. I focused a little bit on what many probably might have expected to hear about justice in the distributive justice, income justice. But I must say that time doesn't allow going into other forms of justice in terms of social interaction and also political system as well. Unfortunately, it is the fault of Muslims who are not following those normative principles that sometimes is perceived by the public as true Islam. Islam and its rules, documented from its source, is the argument against those who do not abide by it. But it's rather unfortunate that many people would say, look, Muslims are doing this and that, so that concept is irrelevant. Muslims are doing this and that, so it doesn't mean anything. No, it does mean everything. It is them that they need to correct. And I think, as mentioned earlier by other speakers, and emphasized by myself in many presentations, Muslims, as Muslims, not because of political pressure, as true Muslims, need to engage in a great deal of self-criticism. I've always advocated not only interfaith dialogue, but intra-faith dialogue. And I believe other religious communities need to engage in the same. Thank you very much, and let's have some time for discussion. You want me to come here or answer from here? Whichever.
Jazakallah khair for that. I'm sure most of the audience will agree with me that we could carry on for another hour and quite happily listen to him. But unfortunately, we have to cut him short because of time. Salah will be in about 15 minutes. So what I'll do is I'll take 3 questions and then put them to Professor Badawi. So please raise your hands and make them questions rather than statements, please. So any questions? Sister here. Anybody else with questions, please raise your hands.
Dr. Badawi, you just spoke about interfaith dialogue. In countries like Egypt, for example, I come from Egypt, how do you think what form should that take? I mean, in light of how demonized, for instance, parties like the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, are being treated?
Interfaith dialogue is not even new to Egypt. It's not as much as we'd like to. It's not as widespread and profound as we find in the West, have been myself one of those who are actively involved in this. But I do understand that, for example, during Sheikh Ghazali, Muhammad Ghazali, there were dialogues between himself and the Christian patriarch. There have been also dialogues between Sheikh al-Azhar and others. But I think dialogue is needed also now, not only between Muslims and Christians, but also dialogue among all, like you said, about the treatment of religious groups who are not engaged in violence. And it's rather unfortunate that they should be treated better. And actually, there should be dialogue between them and the government. They have always called for dialogue with the government. But if you're going by yourself to engage in dialogue, it is not dialogue, it is monologue. So it depends on the other side also. I think I promote and encourage dialogue even between those who have major differences of opinion. It is much better to dialogue in a civilized manner by words than dialoguing by jails and missiles and bullets.
Assalamu alaikum, thank you. This question comes from Malaysia. Malaysia likes to view itself and is very much viewed as a rather progressive Muslim majority country. What do you think of the reactions last month, I think? The National Fatwa Council concluded that intra and inter-religious dialogues are not a step in the right direction. They are labeled as liberals, and this is not an official statement, but unofficial feelings are that such people who engage in intra and inter-religious dialogues are viewed as almost kuffar. Thank you. Can I have your comment, please?
Again, we should follow, I believe, and I try my best to follow the proper methodology. I don't look about the statements of X or Y or Z. A basic aspect of proper methodology of understanding any topic in Islam is to refer to the primary sources of Islam. So I'm not going to comment as to what is right or wrong with that opinion. I'm just going directly to the Quran itself. Does the Quran promote dialogue? Yes, indeed, and anyone who denies that, he has not read the Quran. Look at chapter 29, verse 46. I'm not speaking just to say it is in the Quran. I can give you more and more. Chapter 29, verse 46. It addresses Muslims, especially in dialoguing with people of the book. It says, argue not with the people of the book except in the best ways, which means also most courteous, most rational, except for those of them who commit aggression against you. And say unto them, we believe in what has been revealed to you and what has been revealed to us. Your Lord and ours is one and the same, and to whom we submit. Does that call for dialogue? It does call for dialogue. Does it have to be dialogue only among Muslims? No, this one is between Muslims and other faith communities. If dialogue is forbidden, how the Quran provided an etiquette of dialogue? Secondly, when it says we believe in the original revelation given to you and the revelation given to us, isn't that dialogue? When I quoted or referred to also the Bible and the Quran, both agreeing on sanctity of human life. Dialogue also is not fighting. Dialogue is discovery of common ground. And this verse actually is a good roadmap, you might say, for that. When it says your Lord and ours is one and the same, does it mean ignoring that there are profound theological differences between how Muslims see, for example, monotheism and how the concept of Trinity? They give a different explanation. But is it not true that Jews, Christians, and Muslims ultimately believe in the oneness of God? I'm not saying everything is the same and everybody must believe of some kind of mix between all of them. But it means you have to respect people's right, but see the areas also of commonality. When the Quran speaks in chapter 16, and I think it's verse 90, that you invite to the way of your Lord in the most beautiful ways. How do you invite to the way of Lord except sharing? And sharing means dialoguing. If you look at the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet himself engaged in dialogue. We know more than one delegation from Christians came to dialogue with the Prophet, especially the famous Najran, or what is now Yemen's delegation. who were received by the Prophet in his own mosque in Medina. And he dialogued with them, they spoke about their beliefs. The Prophet also presented his message. Some narrators say that during that discussion, they sought to take permission to leave the mosque of the Prophet. He said, why? He said, to do our prayers. He said, you're welcome to do it here. And we're talking 1400 years ago. Throughout Muslim traditions, some dialogues were polemics. I don't agree with that, like Ibn Hazm or Ibn Taymiyyah. Some have been more reasonable in their dialogue, but we find very famous scholars, Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Taymiyyah and others, who engaged in dialogue with other communities of faith. So if the Quran, the practice of the Prophet, the practice of many renowned scholars is to promote dialogue, then who is anyone to say that it is haram or kufr for that matter? As far as dialogue between Muslims, the Quran speaks about reconciling differences also among Muslims by dialogue. So they're both well-founded.
They will be held in marquee number 1. Please make sure that you can either make ablution or you can make ablution at the marquee area. Please can you leave from the main entrance and the steward will direct you around the building to the prayer facility. The walk can take 5 to 10 minutes. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu
The last question from the sister.
I was just wondering what you think what Islam has to say about immigration laws in terms of social justice, because obviously there's a tension between justice for the people that live in a community, having contributed to that community. Is it an injustice to them to have open borders, or is it an injustice to have closed borders because we've all been given the universe, as you say, together?
Okay. I have just one remark, because in the beginning of your questions, and many people ask what Islam says. I cannot say what Islam says, but I say humbly what is my understanding of Islam, because if I make a mistake, it should not be Islam's mistake, it should be mine. It's just an observation. As far as immigrants, you know, sometimes the word immigrants is used in such a way that you want to divide citizens of the same country into different categories. I was addressing a group in Ottawa, which included some former parliamentarians, and somebody was using the term immigrants. And I said, all of us are immigrants, except for the Native Americans, Canadian or American. And even then, I don't know, maybe they migrated from somewhere else. The main difference really is recent immigrants and older immigrants, especially that applies to the United States and Canada. So let's not just speak about immigrant versus, you know, at least in that sense of having two different classes of people. If somebody entered and was accepted as immigrant, it doesn't matter at which point of time, you know, they entered the country. On the other hand, the Commonwealth of Islam, but of course it is historically contextual. We don't know whether this applies to the complex world today. It was open borders, and any person who travels and stays in one place, he was accepted. In fact, there are some jurists who said that if a person immigrates to a country and lives there for 4 years, that's a very ancient idea. 4 years, he's regarded as a citizen. It's very similar to what's the system in many countries like Canada, United States. You have a certain residence as a legal immigrant, after which you become a citizen for that matter. But I must say, we have to look at it also in a balanced way. There is obligation not only on the, you might say, the older immigrants or the original population in case of a traditional country, and the immigrants. Both have mutuality and obligations. Treatment according to the law, and equality, mutual respect, respecting the particularities of every community, like hijab, for example. That should be a matter of respect of people's beliefs and practices, so long as it is not infringing on the rights of others. But as many fatwas, and I'm speaking again being a member myself, even though I don't deserve it, of the European Council of Fatwa and Research, and that's why from where I came last night from Istanbul and going this afternoon, inshallah. had several fatwas already, several verdicts, that it is wrong for any immigrant to simply say that because we are living in a non-Muslim society to cheat on taxes or welfare, and it indicated in no uncertain terms that the ethics and morality of the Muslim is not only limited to dealing with Muslims, but dealing with all human beings, including, of course, the countries where they have migrated. On the other hand, of course, the question of discrimination against immigrants, whether it is clear or subtle, still within the law, it's a matter of conscience really, is something that I think both communities need to work on. And my humble suggestion is that we need to have joint committees of people from different faith communities representing immigrants, representing decent people also from the host, quote-unquote, countries, to work out these problems in a civilized and peaceful way.